We are Ann Hamilton,
And Johanna Burton.
and today on Always Subject to Change, we're joined by artist, writer Carmen Winant, who is the Roy Lichtenstein Chair of Studio Art at The Ohio State University Department of Art, where we are colleagues. Carmen, it's nice to see you.
Nice to be here.
So Carmen's work with found accumulations and arrangements of photographic images takes a critical approach to the depiction of women, and her work circulates in gallery exhibitions, in books, and on public billboards. Carmen's project, My Birth, was exhibited with great acclaim at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and she has also exhibited at our beloved Wexner Center for the Arts. And last year, her book, Notes on Fundamental Joy, was published. So Carmen, it's a pleasure, and Johanna, glad to see you again. So these conversations are not focused so much on particular projects, but more this moment in time and where process and practice are, and how you are really in many ways finding yours, how it's modified by or changed by not only the time, but how your questions change in response to this moment. And so I actually wanted to start out today, Carmen, asking you about those two words, practice and process. And I know, a little bit from your background as a competitive sports, that maybe they have a particular meaning that might be different than another studio artist.
Indeed. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's so nice to be in conversation with you two, and I'm just going to proceed as if we were all having lunch together and talking the way that we might talk, which is how it feels to be in conversation with you both. I was really excited by the prospect of talking about practice and all that it holds, as I've spoken to you, Anne, about my sort of perpetual and perpetuating interest in the idea of practice as applied by artists. What is this word that we use with such sort of ubiquitous application, right? It's as if everything is practice. Practice is sort of the research and the product. Practice is the sort of mistake making, and it's also the yield. And you're right in pointing to, for me, for my life as my former life as a competitive long distance athlete. I was a long distance runner. And for about 10 years of my life, from the time that I was really a pre-teenager until and through my athletic life, running cross country and track and field at UCLA, practice held an entirely different meaning. There was an entirely different function. It was a place I went. It was a thing that I did, right? Say from like 6:30 in the morning to 10 in the morning, and then again at 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. And around the same time that I was really entering my height, my potential, my sort of reaching towards my greatest potential in athletics, because of course that's what practice is, always the sort of reaching, never the arriving, never the climax, the sort of the infinite rehearsal of the thing, which athletics will teach me more than anything else. Around that same time at UCLA, I was becoming injured quite a lot, which is something that happens to long distance runners, particularly young women. I actually had a stress fracture in my back. And it was around that time that I applied into the art department at UCLA. It was one of the few departments that you had to apply into. And what luck I stumbled into, right? I had been recruited to UCLA from my home in Philadelphia across the country. I had very little idea of what the art program held. I certainly didn't know who Kathy Opie or Jim Welling, or at the time Waleed Beshti was there. I didn't know who those people were. And they all taught, freshman level introductory classes. I stumbled into Kathy's class at the same time that I was sort of attending practice 2 times a day, sometimes 3 times a day, logging every mile I ran, every bit of food that went in my mouth, peeing in front of a stranger, once a month to rule out the use of, any kind of drug, not just performance enhancing drugs. That was practice. And then all of a sudden I was in this environment where practice meant something sort of entirely foreign, maybe partially foreign, maybe not. I remember there was one other athlete I knew at the time who was a star football player, who was an artist, and he was sort of a celebrity around campus. And I said, what is this practice word that everybody is using? What does that mean? And he said, oh, it's simple. It's like, what we do with our bodies, just do that with your mind. And I still remember that and being suspicious of it. So anyway, this is a long-winded and somewhat circuitous way of saying that I came into practice and my understanding of what it was to be an artist in practice through a very particular perspective of being an athlete in practice. And I carried that over with me, the potential. And maybe this is something that we could talk about, but for so long, I think, and now, as I've been talking about and thinking about and writing about the potential of practice for the artist, I've been met with other artists who express frustration at the word for all of its professional, sort of legitimizing functions, for that sort of correlation into the professional world. And I feel as though I have this unique perspective where I think no, there's actually another kind of practice that we can talk about in correlation, and one in some ways that's every bit as meaningful and generative as professional practice, and that is athletic practice. And I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Well, I don't know that it has an answer. But I think that, you're talking about how you prepare yourself. Like in some ways as an athlete, it's a daily regime, really. And I think that for an artist, how you prepare yourself it may include a regime, but it's harder to identify, right? And so what is it that you're preparing yourself for? Like when you're competing, you're preparing yourself for the race or the game or the whatever. And I think that, like when I think about the word practice, I'm also thinking about what is it overarchingly that might connect the way one approaches one's work that's not specific to a particular project.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe one way to address that is to say that so often for me, if I'm being interviewed or it comes up in conversation, like, oh, you used to be a very dedicated athlete and long distance runner, and isn't that interesting in relationship to what you do as an artist, as in there's a sort of facile comparison that's made. Like they both require a lot of hard work and you're building up towards some climactic event. And for me, actually, there's something much more nuanced that is more horizontal. It applies to both, which is to say that for me, the most interesting and vital and sustainable part of athletic life for all of those years was the practice, right? In athletic life, the sort of delineation between practice and performance is quite intense and dialectical. And I always felt that to be in practice was such a complicated thing. It was to sort of perpetually be coming in contact with failure, not just sort of superficial failure, like who's winning and this kind of training effort, but like an internal physiological failure, sort of micro tearing of your muscles in order to sort of build and hatch, right? Like the sort of hypertrophic effort that your body is doing to become stronger is actually about an internalized failure, and the way that any sort of bodybuilder might tell you. So there's this really interesting sort of coming in contact with failure. There's this really interesting thing that happens with repetition. That's something close to the masochistic, or what Deleuze would say is like the, it is in fact, repetition is in fact paraphrasing here, but the manifestation of repetition as pleasure, let me say that again. It is the manifestation of masochism as pleasure, because we are constantly being put in contact with the feeling of anticipation, which is why we repeat and repeat. And so there's something so compulsive about that. And so there were all of these things that even as I was doing them felt really complicated and interesting and hard, around failure and performance anxiety, and repetition and rehearsal and ecstasy, that were powerful and felt close to art making in this way that is so rarely brought up, because the comparison is often made so reductive around hard work or doing something again and again, or sort of coming into some climactic event. And so I guess I would sort of like meet that question with a question to say, you know, in what ways actually are they alike, that kind of practice making? For me, that's been a sort of a much more generative yield, is to think about what they teach me about each other, instead of, you know, in what ways are they dissimilar, or can I pull them apart?
I wonder a little bit, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I wonder a little bit about the comparison, because I think there's also, it's wrapped up in sort of capitalist cause and effect. So in sports, you know, practice is the thing that people must assume you do if you are really good at the sport. You can see it in your body, and you can see it in the way that you perform, even if you do not win the race. But I think people still don't understand what goes into art making, and there's a kind of larger assumption that it's harder to track what the work is that you do, that you put into artwork, and the finished product. And so I think part of it has to do with the dissonance between these two modalities, and that the practice of art making is usually manifested in what's hung on the wall. And so I think why people become so interested in it, or at least why I'm so interested in it, whatever we call it, is that you can't map the pre-work onto what the work is in the same way that you can with something like, and maybe that's true for sports too, but I think people assume here's this basketball player, you can see written onto their body the work they've done to get to that place. And I think art still belies this sort of traceable process. And so people, and actually it's something I'd love to talk to you about, Carmen, which is your work, which is often talked about in terms of photography, isn't you very often taking a picture at all. And so the way in which we kind of map definitions onto people that don't fit very well, but it's what we have. And so I maybe would ask you to talk a little bit about that, that disconnect first, in terms of what is the prep work you do? Because I think your work also it would be hard to trace that preparation in some ways, and also easy. But then also how the practice of photography is kind of discordant in your own work.
Yes, indeed. I sometimes describe myself, depending on who I'm talking to, either as a lapsed photographer or as a photographer who no longer makes my own pictures. I mean, to tell you the truth, Johanna, I'm sometimes delighted when people call me a photographer.
Are you?
Because it depends on the context, but I think there's really something interesting about occupying that position and inserting myself in that history as being someone who doesn't make pictures, but, you know, trades in them, or compounds them, or sort of brings them into new contexts. That I like the idea, actually, although I wouldn't necessarily always describe it, you know, to myself. I like the idea that I can live within photographic realms, like in Lucy's show at the MOMA that Anne mentioned. But the larger point is definitely taken, and I think in part it's the reason that I work in the way that I do, which is to say that I try to collapse the space between studio life and vibration and heat, and, you know, and the sort of the occupation of the whatever it is, the white cube, the gallery space, the museum space. I try to bring those things as close together as possibly can be. I remember, in fact, when I was installing that show at MoMA, my installation in the context of that show, and I was one of the last people to install, and it's a new photo show. So of course there are these beautiful, you know, glossy, framed, you know, photographs all around me, which I love. Like that's what I was trained in. I made photographs like that for a long time. And there I was taping up my little images that I cut out of medical textbooks, that I cut out of feminist pamphlets, the same way that I would in the studio, with the same material that I use in the studio, which is blue painter's tape, because it's so easy to sort of pull off. It doesn't leave a residue. And the idea there was to create something as unfixed, a photograph as unfixed as it might be in the studio, and to sort of, collapse those possibilities, to the best of my ability. That doesn't mean that as it's happening, I don't feel really vulnerable about the process, particularly when the images that I'm taping up in that case are, bodies splayed open, pushing other bodies out of them. There's a kind of like double vulnerability that's built into the prospect of that. But it, I think, tracks back to what we're saying around sort of the function of practice as the site of repetition, of vulnerability, of the sort of the infinite rehearsal and never the climax. The idea and the hope is that the work actually occupies the sort of the potential of practice itself, in that way, instead of sort of being something I describe, as a practice, that it instead enacts practice. And sometimes it's more successful and sometimes it's less successful, but that's always in my mind, and it really comes from a place of being an athletic practitioner, such a dedicated way for so many years.
In that particular installation, My Birth, Carmen, you talked earlier about this sense of, in the training as an athlete, also this sense of anticipation, being perpetually in that kind of space. And I think that, so I'm curious, when you installed at MOMA, you installed 2 walls that were opposite each other. And it's a field of images that are cut out, as you said, from other publications. They're all pictures of bodies of birthing, women giving birth in some part of that process. Did you have the sequence of that arranged beforehand? It becomes a field. And I have always wondered, I've always wanted to ask you, actually, are you composing, are you making it as you're putting it up? Or is it something that you're transporting there that's already figured out? And if it's the former, does it then carry this anticipation and this active sense of it's being made, it's not being installed, which is, I think, both a process, but also part of the practice?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And you're right in that it is determinately unfixed. And being made is a better word than being installed, which freaks out a little bit, I think, museum. For good reason. They kept asking me, like, when you have a map, what's the plan? And I kept saying, like, no, I need to just arrive there. And that installation in particular took a little over 4 days. And in the beginning, I was working with 2 preparators, and by the end, we were working with something like 6 or 7 to get it done. That's not my preferred way, because you have so many different logics, and it's so important that the work read as one piece. And so the sort of sub arrangements and micro flows are important. If I had it my way, I would be the only person installing it. And then the same goes for sort of as it comes down and the potential of its rearrangement. MoMA acquired that work, which was really great. I hope it's shown again. I don't know that it ever will be, because it's so, to say that it's unarchival would be, sort of an understatement. There's some images there that feel close to turning into dust. But when they took it down, they said, should we come up with a map for, for when and if it becomes reinstalled? And it was really important for me to say, no, it needs to be made again, to use your word, Anne, rather than installed again. And so there were a lot of conversations about the ways in which it could be made again, which is a really interesting process for me, because I've never had those kinds of conversations with that nature of work, within an institution. So it was actually quite useful to me to imagine, well, could it be on a single wall? Could it be in a vitrine? And what about the function of the book that you made sort of vis-a-vis this? Does that book always need to be close by? And so it was generative and complicated, and I didn't have the answers to most of the questions, but I hadn't thought of them in the first place. So I really appreciated MOMA for that, for how sensitive their approach was.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, well, I want to turn the conversation just a little bit because to talk about where your images come from and also the categories of organization. So you're talking about within this collection, how you might sequence that field and how it might be perpetually something that can change. And so every circumstance shifts potentially how it might actually look. But it's, I was thinking about that. I know that some of your work is in archives, looking at photographs in archives, and how you might enter an archive is very different than how a historian or someone trained in another form of research might enter. And my sense is it also carries complicated questions for you, thinking, how am I going to make with this, which is different. And how do you respect that material and its origin and its original context relative to what you might bring it into? And then I have a follow-up question.
For you, and I'm holding myself back from returning the questions. But I certainly look to you as somebody who works this way so sensitively. This project that you mentioned in your intro, Notes on Fundamental Joy, was the first time that I ever worked inside of an institutional or a series of institutional archives. In fact, I've always thought of myself not necessarily as an anti-archive maker, but as someone who sort of circumvents institutional archives, in fact, to make archives where there were none, or to sort of come up with these demi-archives, as was the case with the birth work, to fill a kind of vacuum or to make a vocabulary, at least where I felt that it was lacking. And so it was really a curious exercise for me to say, like, go to the University of Oregon, where the largest archive for this project is based in the Lesbian Land archive, and figure out how to use it. I mean, that was really the first challenge, frankly. It's some of the systems feel baroque to me, or at least outside of sort of the realm of, of sort of my imaginative possibilities, organizational possibilities. And so it was really months in just figuring out how to navigate the archive and educating myself on that. And then beyond that, and sort of into, the harder part of your question, how to approach that material with sensitivity and nuance, and how to sort of complicate, say, a photograph, or sort of inculcate, let's say, into my own project, a photograph made by, in this case, a photographer in 1981 on a woman's land, which was a women's only lesbian separatist commune, effectively, although they didn't use that word, in this safe space, in this space away from, the sort of civilized world as we know it, away from the patriarchal world, perhaps topless, perhaps entirely nude. How to then take that photograph, which lives in such a certain place and time, in such a certain political and social context, and maneuver it into my book, which would be a sort of outward-facing project. That continues to be a really complicated question, Anne. I mean, I wonder how you contend with it. In my case, I worked as closely as I could with the photographers, those who are still living. In fact, many of them are not still living, this is a separate conversation, but I do wonder about the function of the chemistry in the, that they were working with. There were so many photographers of that era who passed away young. And that was certainly the case here, but there are some of them that are still alive who became very closely involved with the project. And one of them in particular, Carol Newhouse, who has worked as a social worker her whole life when not living on the land, who has never had an exhibition, who is an incredible photographer, whose work is so immensely tender and historically specific and important, who's become a close collaborator and friend. She lives in Northern California, and she called me a few weeks ago as she was being evacuated from her home to consult with me around which negative she should take with her when she left.
Wow.
And it felt like such a scary and also intimate moment between us. And so that's just to say that really for me is like the potential yield of a project like that one, more than, I really mean this, more than like if a certain curator sees it, you know, or if it, whatever like kind of professional accolade is to build a bridge like that one, and to create such a meaningful relationship. But it's not going to be that way every time with everyone. And I'll be the first to say that the way that I work proposes real ethical complications. And that is in some ways at the heart of the work, but it's also something that can be really wrenching. And I've confronted it on more than one occasion.
Mm-hmm.
Carmen, I wondered if you could talk a little bit, I think the three of us share maybe differentiated, but really fundamental commitments to feminism, and have for a long time in our various practices. And I'm curious to hear you talk about how it manifests today as we're encountering, I think, really productive and positive conversations that demand that we look more intersectionally, which I think is a positive outcome of a really terrifically difficult moment in time that isn't a moment, it's hundreds of years. But I feel like that haunts some of our discussions always around feminism as a kind of history that we hold on to, but also as a trajectory that we protect and move forward. I was looking today at some of your work in preparation for this talk, and obviously you also have histories and legacies of conceptual photography. I was looking at White Women Turn Away?
You got it.
Or Look Away.
White Women Look Away.
Piece, and thinking, you know, it's interesting because there's always been a kind of neutrality around conceptual photography that wasn't there, that you've played with, and I guess I'd just like to hear you talk about feminism a little bit in this moment, and holding on to the kinds of relationships that you just described, but also problematizing those histories as much as we forward them.
Wow, well, I would love to hear you talk about this, Johanna, but I'll take my best stab at it. I was interviewed recently by someone who asked me something along the lines of, like, talk about how you use feminism in your work or as a theme in your work. And I had to sort of stop them and say, like, no, it's sort of the other way around. Art making is a channel for my feminism. Yeah. And I really mean that. It really feels not just like something that I speak about, but something that speaks me, which that language, I might add, was crystallized for me by the Sarah Ahmed book, Living a Feminist Life. And so Ahmed, right? I mean, Ahmed is a real kind of authority on this. She writes about the ways in which we occupy our feminism, and the ways that we sort of don't just participate in a movement, but are moved by. Mm-hmm. And that feminism is not the thing that necessarily happens in the ivory tower, in the like kind of capital A academy. It's a thing that not only happens around our kitchen tables, but happens inside of our bodies. And as she says, and speaks us. Mm-hmm. Reading that text was really revelatory for me. And I think about it often in my life and in my work. Yeah, I would absolutely concur. I mean, it's not news at this point that second wave feminism, which was once called women's liberation, you know, at its more radical stage, was tremendously exclusive. I sometimes use the term white feminism, and I sometimes reject it because I know of so many white feminists in that time who were actually practicing a kind, you know, what we would now call something close to like intersectional politics. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, it's tricky because it would be so sort of foolish to turn away from the fact that it was in a lot of ways a kind of feminism, not just for white women, but for for white middle class women. The idea that the thing that would free women, what would really free them, was to sort of turn away from a life in homemaking and enter the workforce, is of course to overlook the fact that there were so many poor and, you know, largely women of color already in the workforce, right, who were most certainly not liberated, or who were perhaps, you know, sort of the housekeepers for the sort of the aforementioned class of women, which is what makes an artist like, say, Merle Lederman Euclid so powerfully prescient in her, you know, in her work like maintenance art, which was made in 1969, like before feminism was even called feminism. I mean, it's really radical to think about how she, you know, teased out this connection off the bat between the women class and the working class, as, you know, as constituent groups that were undervalued, underpaid, if paid at all, you know, that did the shit work, basically, and made that the center of her work and, you know, her sort of continued life efforts. It's been, like, I might add, a total joy and surprise to be, now I'm in communication with Merle and we're working on something together, and it is like, every time I see her name in my inbox, I feel like this pang, you know, of corresponding with a hero, which is, you know, along the lines of working with Carol, like a relationship that's built on mutual trust and curiosity and admiration. Certainly with Merle, you know, mostly, like, you know, my admiration in her direction. And so that's to say that feminism is changing. It is and should, you know, be an evolving force as sort of axioms change. I tend to be more allied with a kind of radical brand of feminism, to, you know, to sort of come clean. That is something closer to, there was a great book written by Cynthia Aruza, Nancy Fraser, and Tithi Bhattacharya last year, called Feminism for the 99%. That was really in the radical Marxist feminist tradition, which basically says, you know, women, we're not trying to make more women CEOs, we're trying to abolish the system that produces CEOs in the first place. Basically arguing that capitalism and feminism are fundamentally incompatible. And that is a perspective that I ally myself with. But that doesn't mean that that's the only perspective or avenue available to feminists. And one thing I will say, you know, in working with students at the graduate and undergraduate level, is more and more of them identify themselves as feminists, and more of them sort of express curiosity about what that word could hold, you know, for them in their lives. And I'm talking about young women and young men. And so that to me feels like, you know, the most exciting thing. Like, it has the most potential of all.
And relative to your own practice, Carmen, because you write and you make work, and it's like, how do you choose which part or which form actually you need to address what you're trying to address? Like, if you think about that, you know, your practice is there in some way, it's what moves, your feminism moves through it, right? And is given form through it. And how you think about the relationship between what maybe needs to be written and what is expressed in a form that is visual.
Well, I would even expand that to say, how do I think about sort of what needs to come through my mothering and my life as a parent, which I also think of as a kind of work. I mean, this harkens back to Johanna's earlier question around capitalist production. I mean, it took me a long time to feel, I'm still trying to work to feel like one of those things is a capital W work, and one of those things is, like, you know, a kind of lowercase w work, that it's not like, here's the thing I make over here, I can sell it and have affirmation on, like, you know, and within like a capitalistic marketplace. And then here's the thing over here, mothering, that isn't, you know, that isn't work in this meaningful sense, because it doesn't produce results, to sort of go back to the Merle Lederman Euclid's model. And so, you know, sometimes I think, like, well, maybe this shouldn't be writing or art. Maybe this should be mothering. And that feels like radical in its own way. I don't have to produce something, you know, in order to practice in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
But to, I guess, answer your question in a more pointed way, I don't know. How do you know when you have a, you know, where something sort of belongs or what sort of channel it should pass through?
Mm-hmm.
There's a kind of a deep feeling. You know, for instance, I just wrote something about being the mother of sons and sort of what it is to produce and reproduce the patriarchy. And in that case, I had tried to make something in the studio first, and it wasn't working. And I sort of kept circling back to the same questions, which I understood to be at the center. And they stayed at the center as it sort of morphed into a writing project. So I suppose sometimes I throw everything at the wall, and I sort of see what yields. I mean, the real challenge in some sense is bringing them more closely together. Yeah. I have a real fantasy of doing that. And I don't often succeed. Or it feels like when I sort of try to bring the writing and the visual work in contact with one another, the writing ends up sort of explaining the images, right? And sort of the hierarchy of how those things work together. One kind of functions as an explanation, as a caption, as sort of like, you know, the structure that holds up the other. And that's a thing that I'm sort of continually working to undo. And for instance, with that book, Notes on Fundamental Joy, in which there was a text that appeared, it appeared as a single line, exactly across the bottom of the entire one essay, stretched out across all the pages. So I could think about actually text as image, and in some sense, image as information. And that only in that way can I bring the things to touch, although that wasn't really your question.
No, but it's a beautiful.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's a beautiful example because, you know, my experience of looking at the book is that the images, you know, are singular, right? Like they're collaged in some ways, or they have a whole page and you work with a rhythm in that. But because this text goes across, you might be able to hold the image as an entirety, but you can't hold the text. And so you have these motions. And I felt like the voice of the text is suspending and then changing and really animating the images in a way that would be very different if you had a block of text, you know, relative to like an image where they sit as objects on a page. So structurally, I thought that was really interesting how you did that. Johanna, did I interrupt you?
No, we're all going the same place, which is really nice. I was just going to push on the word labor a little bit more, because for me, there's what, and obviously artists as workers, that's something that has been talked about for many decades. And Merle is a great example, right? I think she's still the artist in residence in the Department of Sanitation in New York.
73 or 76 or something.
And I think part of the point, right, is to say, all right, which part of this practice do you actually, will you acknowledge as part of this greater human output or input or activation between me and the world? But I still think, actually, to your point, Carmen, that there, and maybe more than ever, there are demarcations that are very subtly kind of drawn around labor, and particularly gendered and race and sexualized labor too, that pertain really heavily in the art world. So something like maybe moving away in this conversation from practice to labor is interesting, because like it's really about labor in all its forms. But that's still something that for me becomes a really interesting articulation of where the politics live, because it's gendered very often, and again, it's raced, and it's sexualized, and it's all of these things. So I guess I just wonder, you know, again, as we're looking at kind of the legacies that we all care about, the artist as worker looked a certain way, and then there are certain figures that have, I think, continued to pressure what that means and where that line sort of stops. And I do think, I mean, we're all mothers. I certainly feel that I don't stop the kind of intellectual work that I do when I ease into that part of my day, or that you're never easing into it. It bursts into the room and demands you. But but I think that's not valued in the same way as a kind of labor, which is what you were starting to talk about. So I'd be curious to, and I see that, you know, we're getting close to time, but how are you pulling some of that work into, or how have you, Anne, how does it kind of flow through you and into the work beyond the content maybe of the work?
That's a good question and a hard question. And do you have any, I can talk or you can go first with your preference on that front?
I mean, I just think something we've talked about in another context, Carmen, is partly, you know, I think that we have habits of categories, like now I'm working, now I'm not working, right? So now I'm cooking, or now I'm working. And I think it was, you know, you can live in a world of perpetual frustration if you think that when you're doing the one thing, it's not the other, or vice versa. And I think that, you know, we would all be greedy for time in all different ways. But I think for me, I had to, I mean, now my son is not living at home, but I had to think about how it's all part of the practice, to go back to that word. It's all, and everything that happens here is also part of what happens there. And that otherwise you give over to kind of being perpetually frustrated, right? Like you want to be doing this when you're doing that. And so it's really, how can you change how you think about what you're doing so that you can be very present to what it is that's going on, and realize that when you're doing all these things with your kids or your family, it's part of even preparing you to maybe later go into a studio or wherever it is that you work.
And I guess what I'm kind of getting to, Carmen, just so there's a fine point on my question, it's I think it's easy for people to see it when it's the content of the work. You know, like My Birth is a feminist piece, right? And much of the work, or it's considered a feminist piece. We could talk about whether it is or not, or how, you know, Mary Kelly says it's not feminist work, it's art informed by feminism, right? So I guess I'm always really interested in what it means when the content doesn't tell you what the political impulse is. So if you made a monochromatic painting, I would assume it would be informed by feminism. So I wonder if you ever, and maybe you do make monochromatic paintings that I don't know about, but I often get a little frustrated with the content mapping. There's assumptive, something gets lost when you just assume that the content is also the message. And I wonder sometimes what we don't get to talk about because we've decided that that's all there is. And so, yeah, it's a messy question, but it's like, what is the thing that flows through us, and how do we carry it forward without feeling like we constantly have to announce it? I feel like it's always already there.
Yeah, well, it feels like there's a few sub questions in there. I mean, there's a lot in there. When does the work stop, if it ever stops? What's the difference between work and labor? What's the difference between reproduction and production?
Yeah.
I mean, my brother's a labor historian, so he's always asking me, because I'm always using the word labor, and he's always saying, well, what is the difference between work and labor, you know, in the thing that you do, in this practice thing that you do? But yes, I would say a couple of things.
Or you can say nothing at all, Carmen. I know it's a big old wad at the end, but I wanted to be sure that I asked the question about, like, is the content, you know?
Yeah, no, and I can't believe how quickly it's passed. I mean, I would say briefly that I don't necessarily object to people calling it feminist work. I think the thing that feels like, if anything is lacking in that, is that it is sort of presumptive. It presumes that it is a celebration of all things sort of feminist, ideological, historical, and otherwise. And I really think of the work as being quite critical in addition to, and that those conditions live together. And I mean, you brought this up earlier, you know, pointing to the absences, you know, or the fact that when, in the case of My Birth, when, you know, women of color appear, it's often as you know, helpers, right, who are helping the white women birth, or that it was really difficult to find images of non-vaginal births or non-hetero couples, right? And so, like, how do you account for the absences, in fact? And
also how hard it is. I mean, you brought up the failures before. Somebody actually Moira Davey handed me the Mother Reader because I happened to live in the same building that she did. And it was about how really awful and hard it can be. It wasn't a celebration of motherhood. It was like, I thought for a brief moment, I thought I had made a real mistake. And she was like, that's okay. This is okay. That's okay. Like feminism doesn't have to be that you're good at it all, or that you even necessarily identify with all of it. So I see that in your work, but it's often talked about much more in a kind of, it's a full throttle feminist celebration. If you look at the images, that's not what it is at all.
Like it. I mean, I'd like it for it to be both, if
Yeah.
I could. I have so much admiration for the bravery, of the women who participated in the liberation struggle, and were so certain that they would upend like the paternalist order.
Right.
But they did so. They made a lot of mistakes as they went, and so I guess the question is sort of how to hold both. And to your question too, how to imagine and sort of continue to reimagine labor as sort of not only the thing that we do whatever in the factory, in the office, but as the thing that we do when we care for our parents, when we engage in sex work, when we are nuns, right? Like that there's so many sort of different forms to for women in particular to perform their bodies in the world.
Well, and it brings to mind your piece, Women Working.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed.
So maybe you could talk, I don't know if we have any more time at all, but Carmen, maybe relative to that, you could talk about how some of your work has been collections of images in which you're collecting certain kinds of categories. Obviously, we've talked about birthing as one of them. The women practicing self-defense, women working, are two that really come to mind relative to this conversation. And, you are drawing often from printed material that exists in books and in pamphlets and is already in the world. So it comes inevitably from the past to some degree. And so what is it that you're also not finding when you're putting those collections together?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot,
Yeah.
a lot. And my birth is, the perfect exemplar of that. I will say that what tends to open projects up for me, and I'm thinking about this within the context of practice, and, the evolution of practice, one's practice, is my preferred way of working, in fact, is not necessarily to set out with a very sort of narrow frame of, I'm looking for images of women experiencing labor and childbirth. That for me is a quite narrow frame, but something much broader. Like for instance, I'm working on a project now for the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago that is about, if anything is about anything, the tether of women's sexual power and pleasure to their political agency. Which is well-worn, territory, and sort of thinking about like, well, what is that problem visually? Like, what is the potential and limitation of photographic representation when it comes to this most ineffable of things? And that is an interesting problem for me. Start collecting photographs, and I'm somewhere in the middle of that now, so I couldn't tell you where it will lead. But for me, that's sort of much more preferred, and that's how I write too. There's a kind of like, it's sort of, I often describe it as like from the center out, which I don't know is appropriate for everyone, but to sort of maybe bring that all the way back around, I think, is again related to my life as an athlete and sort of building out in every direction, failing in every direction.
Maybe that's where we stop.
To talk to both of you, and it feels so incalculably selfish to just be the person who is talking and not putting questions to other people. So maybe we could do it some other time and where we're not filmed, and I can put the questions back to you.
Well, it was really it went by really fast, which means that we could talk for a lot longer. So thank you, Carmen, so much. It really lays the seeds actually for some other conversations for sure.
Good.